Namaste, everybody. Good evening to all of our viewers in Israel, India, and Europe, and good afternoon and good morning to our viewers in America and in East Europe, Oceania. Thank you for joining us. The Indian Jewish Heritage Center, together with the Cochin Jewish Heritage Center in Nevatim, are very happy to host for our 93rd talk in our Heritage on Zoom program, Professor John Rowland for the second talk on the Immigrants Bene Israel early years. John was born and grew up in the United States. When she was a graduate student, her husband Alan had a friend from the Bene Israel community, Sam Daniel. John will say a few words about him in a few minutes. In a visit that they had in India, Sam introduced them to his family, a meeting that sparked a long affair with the Indian Jews of India. She began her research in India with a Fulbright grant and published a book called Jews in British India, Identity in a Colonial Era. She received her PhD in history from the Columbia University. She taught Middle Eastern and Jewish history in Pace University in New York, and she chaired the history department for a number of years. She wrote numerous chapters, articles on Indian Jews in India, in Israel, and in the US. She lives currently in New York with her husband, Alan. They have 2 kids and 3 grandchildren. Professor Rowland, the cathedra is yours.
So, namaste, shalom, hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Very glad to be here. And as I mentioned to Avner earlier, I'm having a little trouble with my webcam. So if it goes off, please be patient. I've got a backup laptop set up that will take me a couple of minutes to switch to if I need to, but I'm not putting them both off at the same time because I know that they will clash. So I hope it doesn't happen. Sam Daniel, unfortunately, we lost him about a week ago. He passed away. I think maybe some of you know this. It's very sad. It's a tremendous loss for the Bene Israel community internationally, but also for any other scholars who worked on Indian Jewish communities, because Sam was the go-to. Sam was the mediator. Sam knew everyone all over the world and put people in touch with each other. Even more important, in the old days, Sam would send just packages and piles of clippings to people who were working on the Indian Jewish communities and also to the community members themselves, clippings from various newspapers, magazines. And then, of course, when we went into the digital age, Sam went right there, and our inboxes were always filled with all kinds of articles, interesting events. He would alert everybody to events that were going on. But even more important was, I think, Sam's philanthropy in terms of donating a lot of books and tapes and materials on Indian Jews to libraries in India, but also to the Israel National Library itself, to make sure that the communities were as well known as they could be. So it's a tremendous loss. There's nobody who can step into his shoes at this point. There will be a memorial service for him on June 12th that will be live streamed Zoom. And I can get the information to Afna and he can share it with you if anyone is interested. Okay, so last time I talked about the communities in India and the research that I had done over, at this point, I guess about 40 years or so. And Avner asked me if I would talk about my research on the Jews, on the Indian Jews in Israel. And I was very hesitant because as an outsider, as not a member of the community, talking to people who lived through those years, and if not, whose parents or grandparents may have, I felt a little awkward, but he pushed me. And so I just want to say at the outset, I'm talking as an outsider. I'm talking about research that I did in the 1990s about the early immigration of Jews, primarily Bene Israel. Yeah. And I'd like to leave a lot of talk for some interactive conversation. And I hope that some of you will comment on your own experiences or those of parents or grandparents, and maybe bring me up to date. I'm particularly interested in what's going on with the third generation now, how Indian they consider themselves. I know they've intermarried, to what extent they are maintaining Indian culture and customs. So to start off with, I just want to say that I concentrated on the Bene Israel mainly because other people were studying the Cochin Jews, and also because although I did talk to a number of Baghdadi Jews who had come to India, on the whole, the Baghdadi Jews merged with the greater Iraqi community, and they did not maintain so much an identity as Indian Baghdadi Jews, with some exceptions. There was a small concentration, for example, in the Kurdani neighborhood of Kiryat Bialik. Many of the Baghdadis who came there came from Nagpur. They had worked in the mills, they worked with Beni Israel, and they attended a synagogue which was attended by Indian Jews of all communities. Then there were also some Baghdadis who maintained an identity in other areas, in Ashdod and Ramat Eliyahu, for example, maintaining a separate Indian identity. But on the whole, they did merge with the Iraqi community, and that's why I did not concentrate on them. The Beni Israel were the largest community, of course. The latest figures I have, and maybe you can correct me, are about 85,000 Jews of Indian origin in India now. The majority are Beni Israel, some are from Cochin and of the Baghdadi community. The areas that I worked in were mainly Lod and Ramleh, the Kayot near Haifa, in other words, places like Kiryat Yam, Motzkin, Bialik, Atak, etc. Beersheva, Dimona, Yeruham, and Ofakim. And for some reason or other, I don't know why, I did not spend much time in Ashdod in that period in the 90s, where of course there was a large concentration then. I had help from a lot of people, Noah and Svea Masil enormously, Oriella Solomon, who lived in the Kayot, Flora Samuel, and the entire women's community group in Lod Ramleh, including the late Ani Roheker and Sophie and Sarah Benjamin, and later on Isaac and Iris, Flora's children. A very big help to me was Ilana Shazor, who helped put some of these issues in a broader perspective, and particularly in a greater Mizrahi context, even though Indian Jews are not really Mizrahi, although some identify with the community. There was also Dr. Sam Abtaker and his family in Nazareth, who I met with many times. A young woman, I don't know what's become of her, from Ofakim. Her name was Oriana Indupurkar. If anyone knows anything about her, I'd be most interested in hearing. She was in her early 20s at the time and quite active in Ofakim. Unfortunately, I never met Sophie Judah, and there were other leading members that I did not talk to. Also, Ruth Shankar in Haifa, who I understand is no longer with us. So these were my main contacts, and from there it spread out. And I started with a lot of introductions from the people that I knew in India. They gave me names of relatives, family, and friends. I sent out extensive questionnaires at first before I went, asking about all kinds of things, and these could be answered anonymously, but I also mentioned that if anybody was interested in being interviewed when I came, please give me their names and contacts. And the vast majority of those who answered the questionnaires were interested in being interviewed, so that really helped. I concentrated on certain particular areas. One was the early absorption of the Indian Jews, particularly the Bene Israel. Then what was going on in the development towns, the periphery, and the Negev, issues of adaptation, issues of education, certain psychological attitudes which did or didn't help in terms of their absorption, the tremendous discrimination which they faced in the early years, and also some of the religious issues that they encountered. And I was interested in the immigrant community and particularly the second generation. As I think many of you know, the large waves of immigration of Aliyah from India to Israel took place in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, and that it was mainly what we would consider pull rather than push, because as you well know, there was no discrimination, no prejudice against the Indians against the Jews in India. There was no reason that they had to seek asylum as Jews from many other countries did, and they had no need for refuge. So what pulled them was Zionism, a love of Judaism, a desire to live in the Jewish state, but also economic factors, the fact that they felt that they might do better in Israel than in India, now that India had become independent, was no longer under British rule, where they had been given some preferences in the services, and that Israel seemed very promising. They also felt in an independent India that they were too small a community, that there would be nepotism and communal preference in terms of employment. And this is what the Jewish agency, the Sukhnot, advertised to the Indians, and especially the Bene Israel, but the Baghdadis too, in terms of coming to Israel, that it would be an economic paradise, that it would be the land of milk and honey. And of course, that's not at all what they found. And in the 1950s, and again, I think some of you are familiar with, it was extremely difficult. Israel was a young, struggling state, eager to gather in the exiles. The Jewish agency, the Sukhnot, was eager to bring Jews in from all over the world, and many parts of the world they had to bring them in. The Jewish agency, the Sukhnot, was not always very warm and welcoming to the immigrants who were coming, and I think this is especially true of their attitudes toward the Mizrahi immigrants and Indian immigrants. They were a little friendlier to Ashkenazi immigrants whom they knew. And also, and this was unusual in terms of immigration, Jews who went to Israel, to Canada, to Australia, to UK, were basically on their own in terms of finding housing, finding jobs. They relied on contacts, on opportunities, whereas those who came to Israel were absorbed and taken in by the Jewish agency, by the state. The state told them where to live. The state gave them jobs. The state gave them housing. And they had very, very little options in terms of this. Those who had certain skills and who were fluent in English were fortunate enough to be absorbed and settled in the north of the country, or the center, the coastal areas, the Chayot and Haifa. Some of them worked in the Zim lines, and especially in areas like Lod and Ramleh, where they had skills, they had English. Many worked for El Al, many worked in the early years for the Israel Aircraft Industries, Bedek, because the accounts and all the operations were in English at those times. And those people settled down quite well. They did well economically. Their children had the opportunity to go to good schools in those areas, and that was very successful. But the majority of the Indians, along with Mizrakis and also a lot of Romanians, interestingly enough, were sent to the periphery, to the development towns, to places like Beersheba, Dimona, or Yeruham, Ofakim. And I know you've all seen Sofa Lam Shmola, and that was Smola, and that was exactly what it was like. Uh, a bunch of nondescript buildings, jobs in factories, textile factories, glass bottle factories, working shifts. In other words, maybe for a couple of weeks you'd work the night shift, then maybe a month later you work the day shift. No opportunity to go to Ulpan. Those in the center were sent to Ulpan where they became fluent in Hebrew, but in the development towns you had to pick it up as best as you could. It was extremely difficult for them. Women who had never worked before went to work. And those who, someone is mentioning in the chat, absolutely, those who settled in the, I mentioned the Kayot and Haifa, but I should mention Kiryat and Kiryat Shmone also, because there were a lot who went there. Again, it was considered a development and a peripheral town. But women, for example, who had not worked outside the house now had to, or if they didn't and they had children, many women had been used to having help at home. They had servants to help with the housework, to help with the children. They lived in joint families with grandparents, for example, and now they were on their own. On one hand, some found it a blessing because women no longer had to be subservient to the older women in a joint family. On the other hand, it was a hard adjustment. And therefore, the adaptation, I think, in these areas in the periphery was more difficult. The communities remained more Indian traditions, Indian customs. I I remember talking with teenagers from the center and the north who, when they would go to the annual Indian festival at Binyanei Ha'uma, the convention center, Jerusalem, they would find that the teenagers coming from Dimona or Ofakim, they called them too Indian. They even tended second generation to speak Marathi to each other often, which was unusual in other communities. There was a tendency to stick to themselves. There was more likely arranged marriages and by introduction than you might find in the center part of Israel. And one of the things that was difficult for the Indians in particular at that time was their culture, their personalities, the tendency to be quiet, to be reserved. The older generation referred to their community as shy about mixing with others. They were deferential, and maybe they had internalized some of the inferiority sense that they got from the British in India, but very deferential. They were not aggressive. And in Israel in those years, you had to be aggressive. You had to have elbows, or it was going to be very difficult. And many of the new immigrants did have elbows, including the Moroccans, for example, or certainly the Russians. So that made it difficult for them. In terms of education for their children, many of the most experienced and qualified teachers in Israel did not want to go down to the periphery, to these development towns. And so the schools in these areas were not of the highest quality. A lot of children were sent into vocational tracks in the schools, no opportunity to earn about good, and therefore not able to go to the university unless maybe after the army, if they go into the classes offered to help their university. What often happened was that teachers would see Indian children and they were quiet, they didn't talk much, and the teachers might assume that therefore they didn't understand what was going on, and they were placed in lower tracks or in vocational classes. Whereas, again, in places like Lod and Ramle and the Kayot, this didn't happen that often, and there were Indian students who were really excelling in very good schools in those areas. So that was an issue. Also, the Army. In those years, the Indians who went into the Army, and sometimes the women didn't. Some families sent their girls to the state religious schools, or they married them off early so they wouldn't have to go into the Army because they didn't want them mixing with men. But those who did go into the Army, the young men, they couldn't get into the elite units. They were working mainly as drivers, as cooks in the quartermasters units, as file clerks. A few got into the Golani Brigade, and they were very pleased about that. Now, of course, it's different. Indians are excelling in the Army, and they have much higher types of work, but those were issues as well. And then, of course, there was the discrimination and the racial prejudice coming primarily from the Ashkenazi founders and Vatikim, the veterans in Israel, but also some discrimination at the hands of the Mizrahi communities as well. The Indians were darker. Israelis knew nothing about India in that period in the 50s, 60s, 70s, except what they saw from Indian films. They referred to Indians as junglis. The children were called, and again, a lot of you are familiar with this, kushi, the N-word in English, by their classmates. It was very difficult. I remember one story that someone told about her 5-year-old son. She had given him a piece of cake, and it had white icing on it. And he kept asking for more and more icing. And she said, "Why do you want so much of this icing? How about the rest of the cake?" And he said, "No, maybe if I eat enough of this, my skin will be lighter and they won't call me Cushy." And this is very sad. Now, I think probably many of you read the wonderful book that Ilana Shazor edited, and it came out a few years ago, Mother India, Father Israel. Ima Hodu Abba Israel. And a collection of wonderful stories and articles by Bene Israel, mainly women, about their experiences, sometimes in India, but also very often in Israel itself. A great deal of talk about the prejudice and the discrimination that they encountered. I myself learned something about what went on in the kibbutzim, especially from stories, for example, by Rebecca Israel. I knew that the Indians, including Baghdadi Indians who were placed in the kibbutzim, had a very difficult time because the kibbutzim were not religious. Kashrut was not observed. Many of the other customs were not observed, and the Indians couldn't understand this, and they found it very difficult. But what I was not aware of so much was the prejudice that some of them felt as they went to some of these kibbutzim as Indians in general, and the way in which, for example, the Bene Israel children suffered at first at the hands of the kibbutz children. So if you haven't read it, that's a really very important book to read. Now, in the 1950s, and I think some of you are familiar with this, there were massive protests by the Indians, especially the Bene Israel, about the treatment that they were given. Other communities, especially Mizrahi communities, were protesting too. And eventually, about 150 Bene Israel who really wanted to be repatriated to India were repatriated at the expense of the Jewish Agency. And lo and behold, they did not find it so easy going back to India. They didn't have homes, they didn't have jobs. And eventually, many of them quite sheepishly said that they wanted to go back to Israel. And again, the Jewish Agency, in many cases, supported and subsidized their return. But that was a very unhappy episode. And then again, I think many of you are familiar with the major event that occurred to the Bene Israel in the early 1960s with the religious issues that occurred. And I don't want to go into this in much detail because I think you're familiar with it, but the chief rabbi, the Sephardic chief rabbi, who, by the way, had a cousin who was a Baghdadi Jew in India and got some of his ideas from there, issued a directive that the lineages and the divorce history of any Bene Israel who wanted to marry outside the Bene Israel community would have to be investigated as far back as possible, because India did not have rabbis, did not have baked in Vadia Yosef. Thank you. I think it was, okay. I thought it was Itzhak Nassim. I could be wrong about that. Okay, that they would have to be investigated because there were no rabbis, no Beit Din. And if they wanted to marry outside, otherwise they would have to undergo a ritual conversion, a mikveh. And of course, the Indians were shocked and very upset about this. It was only being applied to them and not to other people. For example, American Jews who were coming, Reform Jews, all they had to have was a letter from a rabbi saying that they were Jews and had Jewish parents, and that was enough. Later on, we know about the Russians who came in, many of whom were really not Jews. And this was an extremely upsetting situation. And one comment I want to make here is that this was an issue of halakha, of Jewish law, that the Bene Israel may not have observed Jewish laws of marriage and divorce. There was a problem. Maybe their children would be mamzerim. And it was a question of law, but the Bene Israel took it more as a question of their Jewishness, of their purity, of the purity of blood. They almost saw it in caste terms, that they weren't Jewish enough, that they were half caste, which of course in India is a terrible thing to be. And so they looked at it through this caste lens, and it hurt even more than had they seen it as a question of Jewish law. Well, fortunately, they got a great deal of support from many communities and even Israeli political parties for their fasts and their hunger strikes. I'm sorry to say that Orthodox American rabbis did not support them. They saw it more in terms of an issue of halakha. But ultimately, by 1964, it was settled. The prime minister at the time, Levi Eshkol, stepped in and he made a speech to the Knesset, and he said, look, if this directive is not reversed or eliminated, then the government is going to take over. And so the rabbi at the time, and I think it was Itzhak Nassim, eliminated the name Bene Israel from the directive, specifically applying to them about looking into lineages. And so that stigma was removed, although for many, many years afterwards, there were still occasional rabbis in Israel. I remember a story in Petah Tikva many years ago who raised some questions about Bene Israel marrying outside the community. Now, that incident had many, many ramifications. It's still remembered by some of the older immigrants, and their children knew about the situation. Shimshon was very active at the time, and his daughter Daphna Shimshon-Mishnikov has come out with a book about her father in which some of this period is covered. There's also a book in English by Joseph Hodes called From India to Israel that covers it. The long-term ramifications, there was one in particular interesting one that at that point, many of the Jews from Cochin wanted to distance themselves from the Bene Israel because the legitimacy of the Cochin Jews was not being questioned. They were okay. And they did not want to be lumped together with the Bene Israel. And so it was at that time that they particularly did not want to use the term Hodim anymore, but rather as Kochinim. And that caused a bit of a split. But the other thing that happened in this period was that by the 70s, the Israeli government, like the American government, realized that the concept of the melting pot wasn't working anymore, that they could no longer ask Mizrahi communities to become good Israelis, read Ashkenazim, that they had made a mistake in looking down on Mizrahi culture and Mizrahi family ties, for example, and that a certain amount of ethnicity had to be encouraged. And this was true in America at that time. Instead of a melting pot where everybody gets all mixed together, there would be maybe a soup with chunky vegetables that were still recognized. This was the beginning of the Black Studies movement, Black is Beautiful movement, and every other ethnic group jumped in. Now, in America, to be ethnic is to be American. This is part of your identity. But the Israeli government began encouraging this, and they encouraged activities that were not particularly challenging in any way, for folk dances, folk music, the Maimuna. And of course, politicians began attending the Maimuna celebrations because the Moroccans were a large enough community to be reckoned with at this point. But the Indians, the Bene Israel, were quite slow to jump on the bandwagon at this point because they were afraid that their Jewishness might be questioned. They were a little afraid to emphasize their Indian ethnicity, their Indian culture, their Indian customs, their Indian folklore, because they needed to establish their fully Jewish identity, and they were a little hesitant to do this. It was only really in the late 1980s that you begin to see Indians doing this. And of course, some of this is connected with the extreme popularity of Bollywood and the Indian films. But it's in this period that you see the early Indian cultural festivals in Binyanei Ha'uma, later in Rishon LeZion, and now, of course, in Eilat with the Hoda Yada, in which they really displayed Indian music, Indian dance, mainly Bollywood, but also a lot of Indian classical dance and folk dance, and became very proud of their customs at this point. And then I think the other thing that happened with India is that as more and more young Israeli backpackers began to travel to India after the army service, some 40,000 of it, and they fell in love with India and everything it had to offer. And they came back with a very positive view of India. And this sort of trickled down to a more positive view of the Indian Jews. Not that there was so much negativity towards them, but the Indian Jews had been a very quiet community. They were non-problematic. People liked to hire them. They were good, solid workers, and they never asked for raises. And they weren't problems. They weren't juvenile delinquents. So they were almost an invisible community. But now, with the greater visibility of India, people began to take more notice of them and pay more attention. And of course, the turning point here was in 1992, just 30 years ago, with the recognition, the mutual diplomatic recognition of India and Israel, and the full diplomatic relations established. And of course, a lot of cultural exchanges went with that. So all of this changed in terms of views of Indian Jews at this point. Now, as I say, again, those in the center in Lod and Ramla had a somewhat different experience. Those in the Kayot also. They were more likely to go to the university earlier. As I said, younger Bene Israel from the south were less likely to go. They would go into the army. Some of them learned trades, mechanics, electronics, etc. And when they got out, they were eager to go into those occupations, maybe going for further technical training, etc. So in the early years, the percentage of second generation going to the university of the Bene Israel was actually smaller than the percentage of their parents would come from India. But one thing that the second generation learned to do, whether they married Indians or they married people from other communities, was they learned to be more Israeli, to be more aggressive, to be more assertive, to be more outgoing, less deferential, less reserved. And what I found most interesting about this was the fact that they could also be Indian. They could be Indian on the inside, they could be Israeli on the outside. Their relationships with their parents, with their families, with the Indian communities would be very polite, would be very warm, just very, very Indian in their own way. And on the outside, they were more Israeli. And I think one could say that they developed a kind of a bicultural self in some ways, both Indian and Israeli. And I'm really interested to know about the third generation at this period where you have third generation intermarriages. Okay, I just want to say a few words actually about the religious adaptation of the Indian Jews when they came to Israel. And here it's very, very mixed, because some of the Indians became less religious when they came to Israel. In India, it was a marker of their Jewish identity to go to the synagogue, to observe Shabbat, to observe the holidays, to light the candles. But in Israel, some of them discovered that you could be Jewish without doing all that. You could be secular. The main religious holidays were national holidays. You could observe them anyway. And so a lot of them became more secular, less religious. And yet there were some who became more observant. It was easier. The holidays were there. You could walk to the synagogue. Everybody was lighting the candles. It was much easier to become observant. And so you really had both ends. And then, of course, there were many who said they stayed the same, one way or the other. But what they were most concerned with, and this was true of other Jewish communities who came, was about their own customs and their own practices. Did they follow normative Judaism? Were they mainstream Jewish? Could they continue to practice these things? Very much concerned about this. And then I think it was in the 1990s that a Marathi magazine started. It was called Yad. It was edited by N.S. Ephraim from Kiryat Shmone, although a lot of people contributed articles. And the whole idea of Yad was to discuss the religious observances of the Bene Israel. Was it okay? Was it okay to keep them or not, or not to keep them? Should they let them go? And the general rule of thumb was that if Bene Israel practice was against halakha, then it should be shed. This was their conclusion. For example, the Bene Israel, for example, would look at the face of a deceased person in the coffin before burial. They would line up to look at the deceased face. They would throw Jerusalem mud in the eyes of the person. They would kiss the body. And it turned out that this was not mainstream or normative Judaism, which basically it was only the very close family which looked at the face in the coffin. The idea of not allowing a menstruating woman to go to the synagogue, it turned out this was not normative Jewish customs, and so they allowed women to do that and to go to shrines. So this was these were changes. On the other hand, there were certain practices which may not have been halakhically Jewish, but they were not, Judaism was not against them. They were not forbidden. Things like the hot boshe, for example, the kiss of peace, of greeting each other at the synagogue, both before and after the services, observing Shila Sam, the festival of stale things after Yom Kippur, the idea of singing songs before blessing the bread on Shabbat. There was no reason not to keep these practices, and they did. And the major one, of course, which you're all familiar with, is the Malida, the sort of quintessential special practice, the Eliyahu Hanavi prayers, the special practice of the Indian Jews, which has been kept even into second and maybe even third generation. Often young people go to their parents' houses and have them do it for them on the usual occasions: birth of a child, moving to a house, graduation from the university, going into the army, etc. That no other community does that. Some people have pointed out that they may have picked up things from the Indian environment, for example, with the prayers to Eliyahu, but then the Melita ceremony with offering blessings over the food. That might be similar to the blessings and the distribution of prashad, for example. Also, Muslims have certain ceremonies like that as well. So this is something special which has been kept. Just one last thing that I want to touch on this is the pilgrimages. In India, Jews mainly Bene Israel especially, mainly made pilgrimages to Kandala, where the footprints of Eliyahu's chariot were said to be seen. Muslims and Hindus also went to this place in Kandala because there were some connections with their ritual as well. Also, they would make pilgrimages to the synagogue in Panvel, which was thought to have special significance and power in India, and they would make some vows there. In Israel, they can no longer do that, but they can join in pilgrimage, which many Bene Israel have, to the tombs of holy men. Many Bene Israel have gone to the tomb of Baba Sali, or they go to Meron for Shimon ben Yochai, and of course the cave of Elijah, Kisei Eliyahu. So they've been able to keep up the pilgrimages and maybe even to go on them a little bit more. So I think this is all I want to say at this point. There's more we can talk about. I see that the chat is full, but I haven't been able to look at it while I'm talking. So I hope that Avner, you'll be able to read me these comments. And also I'm particularly interested in hearing from people who want to talk and who want to comment on anything that I, as an outsider, have said. Okay.
Great. First of all, as you said, there's quite a lot of things that are written in the chat, which means that the conversation was, the things that you said were inspiring people to say things, to think about things and say whatever they had. And there's quite a lot of things here, so we'll talk about them. Okay. I'll read some of them, but before that, I'll share with you a few things, some of them that I prepared in advance. There's quite a lot of people that spoke about the decision of declaring and deciding that the Jewish community, the Bene Israel community, if it's the Rav Nisim or if it's Ovadia Yosef. So from what I know, and I will show you guys the letter, the Rav Nissim was actually the head of the rabbinate, but he was against it. And only a few years after that, the Rav Ovadia Yosef was the one that made the decision. And here you can see the letter that Rav Ovadia Yosef issued.
Okay.
He was the head of the Moetzet Chachmei Torah also. And that's what he says. I can read it to you guys, to the Rav David Talker and the ורבני עדת בני ישראל יוצאי הודו וכבוד יקירי ומכובדי העדה, אדוני עליכם יהיו, לפניכם הריני להבהיר בזה דעת תורה, כי עדת בני ישראל יוצאי הודו הינם יהודים כשרים לכל דבר ומותרים לבוא בקהל ולהינשא עם כל ישראל כדת משה וישראל ללא כל פקפוק וללא כל צורך בבדיקות ובירורים. This letter is actually the recognition that he published to tell everyone, guys, get down off the trees, and the Bene Israel are actually Jews, and they can continue. And the last sentence, ויהיה השם עמכם, עזרכם ומגינכם, ויצליחו בכל מעשי ידיהם לאורך ימים ושנות חיים בטוב ובנעימים, אמן. So I'll keep it here. If anybody wants to read it, you can read it, and if anyone wants a copy, you can write it to me and I'll send it to you. The second thing about the ceremonies, well, ceremonies are still done even by the second and the third generation. Ceremonies like the Mendi before the wedding,
Yes.
the Mendi ceremony, the Malida ceremony is continued, and the new generation, an idea that was raised by Mrs. Shimrit Levy, and guys like the members of the young generation, people like Ilana Shazor and Elias Dandeker and Golan and Yoni and other people that were all together, they pushed and changed and made the Malida as one of the festivals in the Hebrew calendar, and they celebrate it every year.
Yes.
And it's incredible and it's amazing. The
Yes.
picture of Eliyahu Navi is still in every Indian Bene Israel house. Most of the houses we go into, you can still see the picture. So, you know, this is something that still remains. In the Bene Israel synagogues, the hymns, the tunes are still according to the Indian style. And if you watched the presentation in the beginning, there is Avichai Basteker from Kiryat Arba that is trying to make a book with all the notes of the hymns, so you can all enter Head Start and assist him raise the funds to make this book come true. Building the project in Nevatim, the Heritage Center, is actually one of the things that we are trying to do. Both NGOs, the Indian Jewish Heritage Center and the Cochin Heritage Center, and in the end of the talk I'll also show you all the movie. This is exactly what we are trying to do, to keep and preserve this glorious heritage that we had in India for the future generations, so they can all enjoy the values that we received and got in India. And the Tomb of Eliyahu, I remember as a child going quite a lot of times, traveling to Haifa, to the Tomb of Eliyahu, having a Malida ceremony in the site itself next to the cave, lighting candles. It's memories that we still have. Now, guys, if anybody wants to talk, then please write in the chat, and now I'll go over it and we'll see who wants to say what. Start. Elias talk about Baghdadis in Or Akiva. Yeah, I think John referred to that. Settled in the northern of Israel, Kiryat Bialik. Yes, she referred to that as well. Elias says many of his family members and community members went to the paratrooper brigades and other combat units, Navy. Well, yes, that's true. In some of them, not a big percentage, but there were a few, mainly the second generation. I think the second generation integrated much easier. First wave protest was 1951-52. That is also something that the young generation, these guys, they celebrate. They're not celebrate. They commemorate it every year. They have a tour in the site itself where the demonstration took place in Echad Ha'am, Rothschild streets in Tel Aviv, and whoever wants to join, just follow the Facebook and publications in the media, and you can join a visit. Ovadia Yosef, Nissim, Rabinet, well, you have the letter here. I think it's quite clear. Although Israelis could go to India even before the India-Israel relation was officially declared, we traveled to India in 75. That was years before. The only thing was that you needed to issue a visa in advance. Amanda, you have a question? Let's unmute you.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you, Joan, for this really interesting talk. I read with great interest your book on Jews in colonial India. I'm a Baghdadi Jew or a descendant of Baghdadi Jews, and I have a question about something that may seem very basic to others here, so I'm sorry if this is too basic. But at the beginning of the talk, you said Indian Jews are not really Mizrahi, but some identify as Mizrahi. And I was wondering if you could explain that further. I know in my own family history, there was a lot of enthusiasm about proving Sephardic identity, I think because of the anxieties about Indianness and Arabness under the British colonial regime. But I sort of am not quite sure how to understand where we fall, and yeah, if you could say more about that.
Okay, I'm really glad you asked that, Amanda. It's a complicated question. I don't want to take up all the time with it, but essentially in Israel at the beginning, the terms were usually referred to as Ashkenazi and Sephardic. Either you are Eastern Europe, America, Ashkenazi, or you came from elsewhere, North Africa or the Middle East. Then later on, Sephardic was broken down into Sephardic and Mizrahi. Sephardic being those Jews with ancestry in Spain and Portugal, but who may have come via North Africa or particularly via the Ottoman Empire in Turkey, Ladino-speaking ones. They were the true Sephardim. And Mizrahi was meant to refer to Jews who came from the Middle East, North Africa, and generally meant Arabic-speaking Jews, generally. Although Jews from Iran, for example, could be lumped into it. So given the accepted definition at the time that Mizrahi was from the Middle East and North African Arabic speaking, then the Baghdadi Jews would fit into that because they did have ancestors in Iraq and they were Arabic speaking. The Bene Israel really did not Arabic speaking, not from the Middle East, but from further east. And yet at times when referring to non-Ashkenazi Jews, very often the Indian Jews, including the Bene Israel, were sort of lumped together as Mizrahi, as members of Mizrahi Edot, of Mizrahi communities. And there were many, many Mizrahis who took up the Indian cause and championed it. And there were many Indians who saw themselves as experiencing much of the same discrimination, lack of opportunities as the Mizrahis, and therefore they also could emphasize with the Mizrahi movement. I think Ilana Shazor was one of the earliest to really put those two together and start working with distressed Mizrahi communities in South Tel Aviv and seeing that the Indian question is part of a broader one.
Okay, thank you, Amanda, for the question. We have Ran. Ran, please unmute.
Yes, I want to thank you, Professor Roland. I want to say two comments. First, about the last question. In fact, as far as I know, there's two Jewish communities around the world, which cannot be considered as a European or Ashkenazi or Sephardi Mizrahi. That is the Indian, except the Baghdadis, which is Mizrahi.
Okay.
The
Yeah.
second one is the Ethiopians.
Yes.
They are neither Mizrahi or Mizrahi, Sephardi or Ashkenazi. Now, the second comments I want to say,
Yeah.
it's about the integration of the communities in Israel. I'm talking mainly about the Bene Israel. The Baghdadi were already mostly Anglicizers.
Yes.
Now, the Bene Israel, maybe it's somehow related to the caste system and the hierarchy in India, but they were in fact, as I saw, two different class. One class was the upper class, those who got the British in English education. They spoke English, they still have this British education. The other were the normal class, who many of them didn't speak English. And they still, many of them in Israel, they don't speak English. They don't necessarily live in South Israel. For example, you said Kiryat Shmona. In Kiryat Shmona, many of the community people, they are from this, the middle class, so they are not necessarily got a British education. I quote mainly the Krayot near Haifa, which were many Baghdadis also. And I just want to say one more word about the dispute about the Jewishness of Bnei Israel, that now I said that in the chat, all the protocols now available in the website of the Israeli State Archives.
Great.
Okay. Thank you very much, Don. I really appreciate that, especially about the protocols and the archives. You know, when we talk Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, Sephardic, I think it gets cloudy, because are we talking liturgically? In other words, Indians consider themselves Sephardic in some ways because they use the Sephardic liturgy. Are we talking socioeconomically? Are we talking geographic, ethnically type of thing? It does get confusing, and I think the usage is very often ambiguous. I think you're right about that. You're also right about the class differences here. And incidentally, a lot of Baghdadi women who came to Israel, and they were fluent in English, whether they came from Bombay at the time or Calcutta, many of them got work immediately as secretaries to major companies, government, etc. Interestingly enough, some of the more working class Bene Israel who did end up in, I would say, in the Negev communities, actually did quite well economically, because some of them were skilled craftsmen, they were masons, they were electricians, they had other carpentry skills, for example, and Israel needed these in the 50s and 60s as the infrastructure was being developed and was progressing. And so very quickly, some of these people found that they were doing better in Israel than they had done in India, which is what the Sukhnot had promised them they would. You know, within a few months, they had refrigerators, they had televisions, they had, or televisions come later, of course, but they had whatever. So it was a very mixed bag. Another thing that happened here is that there were many Bene Israel professionals who came over with experience, with qualifications, and the Israeli government did not recognize them. Even though their university degrees were linked with British universities, they didn't recognize the teaching certificates. They didn't recognize the medical training. And a lot of them got placed, as is true with many of the Russians more recently, in jobs that were below their qualifications and capacity, unless, of course, they wanted to go to another teacher training seminar in Israel and get the Israeli qualifications. But there were, again, like the Russians, Israeli physicians who did not get the jobs that they were entitled to and should have had when they came. in the 50s and 60s because the government, Israel, preferred Western degrees and Western diplomas. So that became another issue as well. But thank you. Yeah.
We have Sarah that wanted to ask something. Sarah, please.
I wanted to comment. I don't want to start a debate, but my father was the chairman of the Amuta, I don't know how to say it in English, of the Bene Israel at the time of the whole thing that happened in the late 50s and in the early 60s.
What was his name, please?
Asher Colette.
Oh, yeah, of course. Okay, sure.
Okay, I'm his daughter.
Yeah, okay.
Hi. And Shimshon was the secretary of the Amuta.
Right.
And
Okay.
as I remember it, there was a long line of politicians who came to our house on that issue, and it became more than a religious issue, it became a political issue.
Right.
And there was a lot of debate on a lot of subjects, but it became a political issue. It wasn't only a religious issue at that time. And it ended in the 1965, like Ran said.
No, I'm very glad that you pointed that out. Thank you for that comment. I think that's very true. And if I remember correctly, wasn't it representatives of Mapam who got involved in supporting
everybody got involved.
Everybody got involved,
yeah. As far as I remember.
Right. Yeah.
There was a talk about separating religion from the state, and there was a lot of
okay.
things running around. And it continued a little bit later by few rabbis here and there, but not as a general issue. And about
thank you very much. That's very helpful, and I'm glad to meet Mr. Colette's daughter. Okay.
Nice to meet you also. And about the issue about keeping all sorts of traditions like the Mendi. For instance, when my daughter wanted to get married, she came up with the idea of doing a Mendi. So I asked, okay, what do I do? So I went to my uncles, my aunts. I asked them, what do you do about a Mendi? So they said, we don't know. It's not a Jewish custom. We never did it when we got married, and they got married to Bene Israel and all, but we never did it. So I don't know from where. It's a very nice party. It's a very nice festival. It's extraordinary, and I did it. But I had to go and search what to do in the Mendi because nobody did it around me, or none of my uncles did, or none of the elder generation ever did it, because it wasn't a Jewish custom.
And yet, in some of the Mizrahi communities, they also did it. I've been to a Moroccan Mendi. I've been to a Yemenite Mendi. I think also, even if it were an Ashkenazi bride and a Mizrahi husband, they would still do the Mendi. The Ashkenazi bride was sometimes interested in doing it. But that now, what I don't know is how common this is amongst in Middle Eastern Arab culture. I think there is something similar to
they call it the
Mendi, the China, right, the China or the henna. So I think a lot of it is coming from that with the Mizrahi communities. Yeah.
But
and it's a question: do you do the designs, or do you just dip your finger in the mud, basically? Yeah.
I don't know. We did the designs because I thought it's more. It's nicer. It's beautiful, but
right, exactly.
I don't know if it's actually it's anything to do with Judaism. I mean, I don't know.
No.
I don't think so.
It may not be. It may be one of these cultural customs that
we
made
adopt,
its way.
that we take in to become to separate ourselves as Indians. So,
okay, how about third generation?
That's a difficult problem because my granddaughter came to me and told me like this. I have one grandmother who is an Indian, another grandmother who is Egyptian, another grandfather who's Polish, and another grandfather who's from Romania. So what am I? I don't know what to answer. Or what traditional dish do I bring to school on when they ask me to bring a traditional dish? I don't know. Whatever you
very
like.
Rich. It's a very rich background. Thank you,
Sarah. Okay.
Could I just ask about the third generation? They would be probably children and grandchildren of some of the people who are here. Are they maintaining any of the customs?
Ruth Greenfield wants to talk, so let's allow her to talk. I can tell you that my parents did Mehndi in India, and they're relatives of Sarah as well. So Sarah, my grandmother did Mehndi to her daughter. She's your father's, I think, elder sister.
Okay.
So Ruthie, please unmute. You can talk.
Hi, John. How are you?
Hi, Ruthie. How are you? Good to see you.
You too.
Good.
Yeah, I say like about my family, I would say that a lot of the people in my family, a lot of cousins, did go to the universities, to the Technion.
Right.
Even ourselves, when we came to Israel with my sister, she went and studied in the university in Jerusalem. So I find there were a lot of people who did go to the universities and the Technion, architectural school.
Yeah.
As far as the third generation, we of course had the Mehndi. Even when I got married, I had the Mehndi. And my daughter and son got married. They specifically asked for the ceremony, but they were like, my kids are not as religious, and they didn't want so much of the prayers to be done. They wanted more the ceremony, as they say, the fun aspect. But of course, I kind of pushed it on them. But I said, no, you have to have some of the prayers. But they do, we are hoping that's what we want also with the Heritage Center that we want to make, that these traditions are kept alive and what they were. Because I don't know what will happen, because all my kids have got married to non-Indians. And we do worry about our customs to be, put down and told in a place where sometimes, let's say, have a great-grandchildren, a grandchildren will ask these questions. So yes, there are people who have married Indians, who have married Indian Jews. So the customs are, I guess, stronger in the house. But suddenly, the moment you marry someone who's not Indian, yes, it kind of trickles down to the generations. So it is very important. And we keep trying to emphasize the Indianness, but it is not as easy, because when you come to Israel, as you say, you become Israeli.
Yeah. I think that's so very interesting, but I think particularly where you mentioned separating out the religious from the cultural is very important, because I think in many cases, what will be passed down is the practice, the custom, the cultural, without necessarily the religious element of it. In particular, amongst, young secular Israelis, the customs, the Melita, the henna, whatever. I think these are markers of an ethnic identity. It's not any longer religious identity, because it doesn't have to be a religious identity. In India, the two went hand in hand.
Right.
It was both ethnic and religious, and every other community had the same thing: Hindu, Muslim, Parsi, what have you. This was a religious practice, not just a cultural one. But in Israel, it becomes more of a cultural tradition. I think the word you're using, tradition, is right. And it is important to keep. It's very important to keep, with or without the religious connotations, if that's what people prefer. But I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you, Ruthie. John, you want to say last words?
Again, I've really enjoyed talking with the group. It's been interesting for me. Avner, I hope you'll send me the chat. I would really like to see that. I also thought Ron's comment about both the Bene Israel or Indian Jews and the Ethiopians being neither truly Mizrahi or Ashkenazi is quite accurate here. That's the problem with labels. How do you define labels, and what are the parameters of labels, and are they helpful? Are they unhelpful? Do labels perhaps hide differences and hide distinctions? Do they sort of crumble them all together? I think this is really an important issue here. But thank you again for inviting me And Avner, I will send you the link to Sam Daniels Memorial in case it's on June 12th, 11:30 New York time, in case anybody is interested in it. I know Ruthie remembers him from the
Yeah.
New York days. Oh, and one other thing I want to say, I didn't realize that Melita was now in the calendar. In New York City, Eid and Diwali are now official holidays. Schools are closed and the parking regulations are off. So calendars become very interesting, I think.
Wonderful. Jai Hind.
Jai Hind, right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Great. Okay, guys. Thank you,
Okay, thank
everyone.
you.
Thank you, John. It was amazing. Goodbye. Shabbat Shalom.